This is the Annex, a sociology podcast. I'm Joe Cohen from Queens College.
I'm Leslie Hinkson from Georgetown University.
And I'm Howard Ramos from Dalhousie University.
We're on the web, sociocast.org/annex, on Twitter @sociannex, and on Facebook, the Annex Sociology Podcast. Today, we're thrilled to sit down with Richard Carpiano from the University of California, Riverside. Richard is a medical sociologist and a policy specialist with a long list of publications, including work on under-vaccination, which I'm very excited to talk about today. We're going to be talking about public health, culture, anti-vax politics, and more. You're not going to want to miss this. So we got a great crew today. First off, Richard, it's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm a big fan of your Twitter feed. I mean, you're obviously a very accomplished researcher, but you also have a terrific feed. If you want to follow me, he's at RM Carpiano. So it's great to have you.
Thank you.
And as you might have noticed, Gabriel will be away for the next few weeks, but not to worry. We have some great substitute hosts. And today we have Howard Ramos from Dalhousie University. Howard is a political sociologist, former president of the Canadian Sociological Association, and a great guide to a special podcasting project that I have in the works and I hope to release in the fall. It's great to see you again, Howard.
Oh, it's great to be part of this.
Howard, what's your Twitter handle again? You got a great Twitter feed too.
It's my name backwards. So Somodar Raho, or Howard Ramos backwards.
All right. And of course, the always wonderful, always insightful Leslie Hinkson.
Yeah, who still doesn't have a Twitter or whatever you call that.
Well, I think now you can't get one.
I totally can't.
It's like it's part of your identity now.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like if I didn't have a dishwasher in my house by now, I should just be washing dishes by hand forever.
What do you want to start with? You want to start with the MAGA hat kid?
Sure.
Okay. Oh my God. All right. So over the past several days, there's been tons of discussion surrounding this story of like an inflammatory racialized conflict that is something akin to like the blue-white dress controversy or Laurel Yanny. You remember those?
Yes.
It's like everybody looks at the same event and sees different things. One thing is for sure, it's a cast of unsympathetic characters all around.
Oh, I don't know about all around, right?
Well, let's get to it. No, not completely all around, although I'll get to it. But it definitely seems custom built for like this age of like heated social media based arguments. Okay, so let's start.
Tinderbox.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll set the stage, okay? So
Okay.
It took place on the Washington Mall, and there was a Native American group who got a license to hold a protest. And near the Native American group, there were 4 men from the Black Israelites. It's like a Black nationalist group, and they set up beside the Native American protest. I presume it's without a license, but like whatever. My sense is like there was no conflict. And then fatefully on that day, there was a Catholic boys' school from Kentucky that came to the mall. I guess they were on a field trip, and these boys were wearing Make America Great hats. So there's like 3 groups, the Native American protesters, the Black Israelites, and this conservative MAGA hat wearing Catholic boys' school from Kentucky. And they all find themselves in physical proximity in the Washington Mall. Like that's already, that's not going to turn out well, right? You know what I was thinking about, Leslie? Yeah, let me give you my interpretation of this just off the bat, because Leslie, I feel like you might appreciate this. You know when you're on a subway car and there's 2 crazy people on the subway car and they somehow start interacting?
Yep. And then they decide to stand right in front of you.
Yeah. And like it's just 2 crazy people who are gonna have their last name. Well, wait, Richard, you're from Jersey, you said? Are you from?
Yes.
All right, so it was like that. Two people on the side.
I can relate to this.
Yeah. So basically there was a viral video that showed one of these MAGA hat teens taunting Native Americans with like faux chants and tomahawk motions, and people go insane. Like they see this like smug looking MAGA hat kid wearing person taunting First Nations people. He's like Brett Kavanaugh 2019. And people start calling for the kid to be doxxed, and then he is doxxed, like his identity is revealed. People start harassing his family. Trevor Noah gets big laughs about wanting to punch him in the face, etc.
And to me, this is actually what's amazing, and just how quick these things spread, and how fast the reaction is. It's like not only having two crazy people in the subway, but two crazy people in the subway in your living room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then new video comes out showing some context, and it turns out that this confrontation came in a context where I guess the kids were having a conflict with the Black Israelites. So there was like the Black Israelites were shouting epithets at the kids, and I don't know if the kids were, I assume the kids were saying something back because they're teenagers. Maybe that's my ageism, but like they're teenagers. So, but they were, I don't know what they were doing. They were responding with like school chants. There's some kid with his shirt off. Whatever it is, it's a standoff, and that's the two crazy people. And then the
And the
Native
claim,
American.
Joe, the claim was that the chant was a way to dispel the negative yelling of the Black Israelites, apparently.
So, yeah, well, through logic, two negatives make a positive, right?
Yeah. I wonder if they
I
teach.
suppose.
I wonder if they teach that at like the conflict management school, right? They're like, you're in a high-powered negotiation. It's getting hot. Start
This
chanting.
is not getting the yes.
Yeah, getting to yes. Oh, that was good. In any case, and then the whole situation gets even zanier. Well, in my mind, and here's the thing: I don't know what to make of the Native American protester. So they're shouting at each other, and then the Native American protesters decide that they're going to walk directly through the crowd of boys while beating their drums. And like they say it was to calm things down, but like I don't really see that as a very effective de-escalation strategy either, right? Like,
I mean, here's my
yeah.
take on it after seeing multiple videos.
Mhm.
Is number one, there's also like context and experience, right? So
Mhm.
perhaps these Kentucky boys have never had to walk down Fulton Street and have to deal with the Black Israelites before,
Mhm.
and so they didn't realize that like what do you do when confronted by Black Israelites? You ignore them,
Right.
right? You
Right.
ignore Black Israelites, and that the vast majority of the people who come into contact with Black Israelites, that's what they do. They ignore them. Every once in a while, you might mix it up, right? But it's usually just to tell them, this is how what you're saying is wrong. I get where you're coming from, but here are the facts, right? So, number one, they didn't seem to understand that. Number two, I think that they were probably already all hopped up anyway, just by all their testosterone and their teenagerishness and all of that. But number three, uh, did they not understand that this was meant to be? This was meant to be an occasion for American Indians, right? And either they didn't understand that, and so thought it was okay to be loud and disrespectful in that space, or they didn't care. Maybe they did know. And that's one of the reasons why they decided to show up, because from the footage, you could hear them saying very derogatory things about American Indians,
Mhm. Mhm.
as well as doing the tomahawk chop, like intentionally to actually belittle and denigrate an entire people.
Mhm.
Um,
Although the one thing that I kind of get worried about when we look at these incidents, and it seems like we see more and more of them going viral, is we focus on the incident, forgetting about, as you were saying, Leslie, the context. The
Mhm.
mhm.
context that creates an erasure of the colonization of indigenous tribes in North America, the erasure of the context of a country built in slavery,
Yep.
the erasure of a context where people can't disagree and respect that they disagree. And that's the conversation we're not having, and which I think makes this moment really kind of scary.
It's incredibly scary to me. And then on the other thing, the bigger thing is I've been thinking a lot more about the weaponization of young people
Mhm.
in this country. I mean, it's so funny. Like we talk about, child soldiers, like, across the continent of Africa,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in the Middle East. And we talk about, young people being indoctrinated into gangs in Central America. And we don't think about the ways in which we pull young people into our ideological wars,
Mm-hmm.
in ways that I think are very unfair to them and to their development, as adults one day. And I felt like that was part of what was going on there. I mean, from what I understand, the teenagers didn't start uh, the agitating until they went to their adult chaperones to ask them if they could do it, and they were like, "Oh yeah, sure."
Right.
Oh, really?
So the chaperones did. Okay, Leslie, I want to push back first. When one is confronted with any type of hate speech, like, is it really incumbent on the young people? Like, if a hate group starts harassing teenagers, are we putting the onus on the teenagers to take the high road? Like, ultimately, they didn't dox the Black Israelites, and we're kind of treating them like nuts. But they're like, those are adult people who are
Yeah,
part of,
they
like,
are.
and they're part of a group that, like, the Southern Poverty Law Center classifies as a hate group,
Yeah.
and yet,
No,
like, we dox the kid.
no, so here's the thing. Like I said in the beginning, they
Hmm.
clearly don't understand who these people are,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because growing up in Brooklyn, you're just like, "Oh, there go the Black Israelites. I hope they don't
Right.
notice me,"
Yeah.
right? And the thing is, like, they are seen as extreme, right? And as hateful, right? Not just by non-Black people, but by Black people too,
Yeah.
right?
I feel like in New York they're more considered street corner nut jobs.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, right? Every once in a while, some like they will say something that you're like, okay, I get it. I
Mhm.
get why you're angry, right?
Mhm.
I get why you're trying to give us the advice that you're giving us,
Mhm.
but it's so inflected by hate and and non-facts
Mhm.
that I can't even listen to you.
Right.
Right? Your whole positive message is totally lost, right? With all of this hate, and negativity. So that being said, I'm not saying that the onus should have been on the kids. Like, I'm going back to their adult chaperones,
Right.
right? Who were like, look, this is a school trip. This might turn violent, right? But I'm going to encourage you, right, to push back anyway. I mean, just think
Mhm.
about the liabilities involved here,
Yeah.
right?
And Leslie, I don't know, this is sort of speaking as an alum of an all guys Catholic high school. Like I couldn't imagine if I was on a class trip for this that the chaperones wouldn't have immediately have like put a stop to things.
Mhm.
And so the whole absence of sort of adult, or at least the adult consent, which I was unaware of until you had brought up, just seems rather shocking in that sense too. But yet the focus in essence we have looked upon the kids and not sort of on the role models or the chaperones that they're supposed to be were supposed to be with them.
I think another thing that's really interesting about this is, it's so interesting that a lot of people are bringing up, they're like, well, they're kids. They're just kids. Like, they
Mhm.
are kids who were up against, right, these grown men. And I was like, well,
That's my belief. Like, that's how I see it.
no, no, yeah. So there are four of them, and then I don't know how many of these kids. That's number one. But then the second thing is, I mean, and I think a lot of people rightly point this out, right? If there are a group of like four white supremacists, right, who were saying things, and there was a group of we'll say it's an all Catholic boys' school as well, but they all happen to be like Latino and African American, right? And they were in the numbers that they were. Would we get, right? Would we be hearing people say,
Right.
oh, they're just kids? I mean, like study after study has shown that, like Americans actually tend to like kind of like not take into account, right, the age of Black kids in particular,
Yes,
right?
they adultify them.
Yeah, they totally do. And I'm just like, oh, I mean, I'm not saying, again, two wrongs to make a right, except in those kind of
Yeah,
logic diagrams that you did in high school. But
right.
but what I'm saying is like, isn't this illuminating?
Well, I also sometimes wonder about these situations in terms of the viral effect that we have with social media and the lack of filters, and what good comes out of spreading this out so widely.
I have
I
no
mean, we're
idea.
having this conversation, which might be a good thing, but are we focusing on the broader problems that create the situations over, feeling good about ourselves that we're calling out specific people?
Hmm.
And in
Right.
this sense, I worry that we sometimes focusing too much on the kids or too much on the incident and not thinking about the bigger historical trends that are at play.
Yeah.
What Howard was saying, I mean, in essence, it's spectacle of what gets focused on,
Yeah.
and not these larger issues. I mean, there is sort of it fits a certain sort of sort of base emotional public craving
Hmm.
for for that type of for spectacle without that sort of broader context and the broader sort of dialogue that can come out of it.
Howard, what's your take on what's the broader problem you're seeing there?
Well, I mean, there's so many broader problems that intersect with any one of these incidents. The one problem is that there's groups of people who are completely talking past each other, misreading situations, not respecting one another, which is, just creating terrible behavior on all fronts. The
Hmm.
other problem is that, instead of actually taking a step back and thinking, should we be, relishing in the spectacle and ostracizing people? Let's take a look at the actions and think about how can we mitigate these actions, because I can't imagine any society that thinks this is a good thing for the society to be going through, where there's so much division and so much tension. It's almost like everybody just needs a timeout.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, Howard. Like, I mean, it's kind of like, so Richard, you're a medical sociologist, right? And
Mhm.
one of the things that, like, one of the things that I'm seeing more and more in publications is the use of the implicit association test, right?
Mhm.
On providers to be like, oh my goodness, is this what is leading to disparate care? And
Sure.
I find it interesting, but I think the much broader problem isn't whether or not practitioners have implicit biases, and more like the bigger problem of what medical knowledge tells them they what it tells them, how it tells them they should be treating their patients, right? So
Right.
if for example patients are being treated differently because of their race or because of their gender, right? Are we really going to say it's because there are a few bad apples, or because implicit bias is just like deeply embedded in us as individuals? Or should we be interrogating the knowledge base from which these practitioners are providing care to people? And I think like that, I think is like an example outside of this, where that exemplifies what Howard is saying is like, why do we keep focusing on individuals and not thinking about kind of like the broader context and why it is individuals then interact in this way in these spaces?
Yeah, right. Exactly. And this is becoming sort of even a much sort of bigger and renewed area within medical sociology too. Of what are the foundations and within training where people learn to doctor essentially and are socialized into medicine as trainees, as students, as interns, and how that medical base or lack thereof, creates these sorts of issues.
Though, Leslie and Howard, what about the particulars? Because, I read an article in Vox in which they had a university professor make the argument that that boy didn't understand the effects that his stare has on people of color and the pain and anger that his smirking would cause. Ergo, he is dismissive and condescending and attempting to domineer minorities. And like that was published on a national media outlet. Like somebody went from generalities, imputed a world of motive onto this kid in very unflattering motive, and that's gonna like follow him
Yeah,
around.
well, I
Like,
mean, you're right, Joe. You're right, Joe. Right, and while I mean, I have my opinion, I wouldn't publish it anywhere but Facebook. But my
right,
Facebook
right.
publication basically responded to. to this teen's remark that he was just smiling, and like the smile was meant to diffuse the situation, and then also he was nervous. And I was like, if that's your smile, good luck getting a date, good luck getting married, right? Because that does not look like a smile to me, right?
Well, it is certainly, the kid was in that moment not looking like he had any goodwill. What I worry though too, though, is that instead of judging people, why don't we just judge the actions?
Yeah,
Good people do terrible things, and terrible people do sometimes good things.
exactly.
And this is what we lose when we blow these things up so quickly.
I mean, we all saw the movie
Interesting.
Crash, right? So
Good movie.
I just wanted to, if I could add something really quickly. Something Leslie said that stuck out with me too is the context of why those kids were there. You were talking about sort of the weaponizing of kids, and this is, I'm to be clear as sort of a starting point. I'm not sort of equivocating things, but I think it does raise some interesting, as you brought it up about thinking about how we socialize kids into sort of activism and different sorts of causes and worldviews about things. They were there for a pro, if it was a pro-life, anti-abortion
yeah,
protest, or
yes,
right, yeah, which is interesting in the sense of that that's looked upon in a derogatory way in certain circles, or in a negative light, and yet at the same time, when you think about certain subgroups of where children get encouraged to be part of protests for other, it could be more popular sorts of causes. So taking out sort of the meaning here of the actual of the protest itself, this is sort of an interesting sort of flip to that.
yeah.
Which your comment earlier made me sort of reflect on. It would be great. Imagine if this was sort of a pro environment sort of protest of which they were there for, or the Women's Rights March or something.
I totally agree with you, and I totally forgot about that connection. And so there are a few interesting things that come up to me, like when, like in being reminded what they were there for. I kind of feel like there's a difference between, like, bringing a bunch of teens who are Catholic. I mean, they're from a Catholic school, and so doctrine, as it is, basically requires them to be pro-life or anti-abortion. It's more anti-abortion than it is pro-life. As a lapsed Catholic, I can say that for certain.
Yeah.
So that's number one. What's also interesting is that it's an all-boys school, right? And so it's very interesting that you have these, these growing young men, right, being so sure that they can dictate the right of a woman to do with her body what she can within the limits of the law. And number three, I think there's also a huge distinction to be made between bringing kids on an anti-abortion or pro-life march, right? I mean, because there are teenagers who have formed these opinions on their own, right? And another thing with, Westboro Baptist Church, they are constantly at the gates of my university. And I remember once there was a kid, a little boy who must have been like 9, handing out flyers with those graphics of like a baby's body chopped up in pieces. And I'm thinking to myself, isn't that child abuse to subject the child to that? So I think there's weaponization, and then there's allowing of space for teens to express themselves however they express themselves, right? I don't know that them being on that march was a way of weaponizing them, but I do feel that what was going on when the chaperones gave them the okay to do what it is they did, that I thought was an example of weaponization of youth.
And Leslie, it was
All
within a
right.
week of the Gillette. Is it
Oh
Gillette?
yes,
How to Be a Man?
I love that.
Yes, but I don't like that. I don't like the idea of having a 16-year-old boy act as a stand-in for, concerns about all of America's race problems or gender problems. Just like I don't like people picking on black teenagers as like, an object to pour scorn on. I think like when I look at the kid, his master status is a kid. Like that's,
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's what do you
Mhm.
see when you look at the kid? Do you see a kid? Do you see a white person? Do you see a conservative? Like, do you see the MAGA hat? Trevor Noah said the MAGA hat was the act of aggression.
Mhm. Well, yeah,
What do you think?
I mean, I don't know. I don't know about that. I mean, I will say, regardless of whether he was a kid, if he was bigger than me and
Mm-hmm.
stronger than me, and he was in my
Mm-hmm.
face, I might be afraid of him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, it's interesting, as I say, because I kind of feel like inner city kids and like kids in rural schools, particularly those who are of color, right, who are big and male in
Mm-hmm.
particular, right, I think are disproportionately punished because people are afraid of them, because they are male, because they are
No
strong,
question.
right, and also
No question.
because of their race. And so
Yeah.
what I'm saying is I totally agree with you. He should not be a stand-in for anything, right? And I think that the only people, or really the only person, like I think who could really comment on what this young man's presence felt like at that moment is that American Indian elder who was right there, right, in his proximity. So
The MAGA hat now is this immediate symbol of, I think in the one article that we had here that was associated immediately as someone equivocated with a Klan mask or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Is sort of
mm,
where the
Mm-hmm.
discourse
Yeah.
is. That it's amazing to think how that the discourse around the MAGA hat has intensified. Where it
yeah.
used to be just something that was, okay, a statement, to then something that was looked upon as being sort of maybe silly or something of derision, to now something that's sort of this explicit, viewed as an explicit marker of racial hatred. Yeah.
And this is where we're seeing a lack of leadership from the president, and a lack of leadership from the Republicans, and a lack of openness to build the bridges to realize that this is not going to end well. If you look at
Mm-hmm.
American history, you look at world history, when you end up having these things as simple as a hat symbolizing hatred, and people reading into that, the end result's never going to be a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I get it. I mean, symbols are just symbols and they can't hurt you, but sometimes a symbol can be a threat, right? I don't equate a MAGA hat with a noose, for example.
Mm-hmm.
If someone was coming at me wearing a MAGA hat versus wearing a noose, right, I'd be much more
Yeah.
threatened by the latter, right?
But here's the opportunity for leaders to step in and say, no, the MAGA hat does not symbolize this. The MAGA hat should not be used in this way, and change the discourse. And when those opportunities happen, the president and Republicans haven't stepped into those opportunities to tone things down. And instead, they like to play it both ways and kind of have that ambiguity to rally a base that's creating a very unstable situation.
Yeah, well, to rally a base around these ideas while also like being able to claim plausible deniability. Oh, that's not what we
Mm-hmm.
meant, right?
Mhm.
We just left it ambiguous enough so that people could read into what "Make America Great Again" actually really means, right? So this past weekend, I went to the Women's March in Washington D.C. And it was interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I decided to go to the march this year. Number one, because I was like, we clearly have not achieved equality yet, so I think I'm going to go there. Number two, I was disturbed by all of the news stories about the divisions with the and then the splintering off and like the different organizations that were now taking this on, with one being seen as, as the Organization for Women of Color, and the other one being seen as the organization that's against anti-Semitism, as though the two cannot coexist.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, okay, fine. I'm going to put on my marching boots and I'm going to show up. pretty much just simply as an act of solidarity. And in some ways it felt like a space of solidarity, but there were also some troubling things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or rather things that troubled me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first was still the preponderance of anti-Trump signage
Mm-hmm.
at the march. And here's the thing: I thought that it was established that just about everybody marching in those marches was anti-Trump. So so can't we move beyond that, right? Because if this is a women's march and this is a march about uh, gender inequality, gender violence, whatever, right? I mean, it's not like Donald Trump got elected and then all of a sudden these things started to exist, right?
Right.
Right.
So he just seems like a perfect straw man, and so that signage bothered me. Because it was so negative, and I was like, let's see a little bit more positive stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, uh, and I didn't know how to, like, I was ambivalent about this. So
Mm-hmm.
number one, there's a huge diversity at the march, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the types of women's groups, the types of women, like the types of issues, right? And
Mm-hmm.
in some ways, that was amazing to see, right? But then in other ways, at one point in time, I was confused. I was like, what are we doing here again? Like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
why are we here again? When are we going to organize around a platform? Or is that not what the march is for? Maybe the
Mm-hmm.
march is really just meant to be this moment where we can feel safe in a mass together.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, people were having a really good time. People
Mm-hmm.
were really jazzed up once we walked past the Trump Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And we, like, people got into it with like the pro-life protesters at the edge. For the most part, people seemed to be very happy to be there, even on such a cold day. And in truth, I left right after the march. I decided not to stay for the rally because, number one, I'm a woman and a sociologist, and I think I kind of know what the issues are. And
Fair.
and um, like the whole thing about the leaders of the march, like I
Mm-hmm.
don't even see them as leaders. I see them as the people who take care of the logistics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, get the get the permit, tell me where to show up, and I'll show up. But
Right.
I don't see you as a figurehead, right? You were not Martin Luther King, right? You were just you were the people who make the march possible, and I don't feel as though we have someone who's emerged like that for women in the march at this point in time.
Well, do
So
you think that the leadership should step aside then if they're causing division and they're not integral to the movement? Should they find different people to file the permits and
my my whole thing is I'm agnostic about it, right? And
Mhm.
this is why. The reason why I'm agnostic about it is because the people who invited what's her name, Tamika Mallory, to
Mhm.
be part of the women's march from the beginning knew
Mhm.
about her ties to the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan then. And back then they saw it as a good thing, right? And then something happened, right, to then make them see it as a bad thing. So
Is
that's
that
why
are you is that for sure? Like where'd you hear about that?
yeah. So I heard about. So number one, if I knew that Tamika Mallory like had ties to Louis Farrakhan before they even invited her, I don't understand how the women who decided to invite her didn't know that,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
I mean, and I understand why they're like, oh, the Million Man March. If that's going to be a model, right? I mean, that was led by Louis Farrakhan, right?
Mhm.
Um, if you want someone who has a totally different perspective than I do, then okay, right? And from what we know, she doesn't seem to be anti Semitic. She just happens to have links to this guy. So, I mean, so that's that, right?
Mhm.
And so if that is the case, my whole thing's like, why was it okay for her to be part of the leadership then, but then it's not okay to be part of the leadership now? And and also number two, I also don't understand why she would still want to lead something that isn't really about something yet. I feel like she could go do something else. So I think it's up to them to make that decision. As I said, I was like, I wasn't there for the leadership, regardless of who they were. I
Mhm.
wasn't there to hear anything they had to say. I was there to actually be in a space to be with people who I assumed were all in for the cause of gender equality.
Like I was supporting the splinter groups only because like my reaction to Farrakhan is very negative, right?
Oh yeah,
Because
I get you. Yeah.
well, I mean, he's he targets my ethnic group with hate speech, so it's
Oh
like
yeah.
so. I remember we had this discussion. Like I would expect people to react to a if an organization was led by someone who worked with David Duke, or I would expect people to react in a particular way, and I would expect that similar reaction for those who work with Farrakhan. What do you think about like the idea that just because a leader associates with Farrakhan, the march is ripe for boycott? Like, should we boycott things that are associated with white nationalist leaders as well, or is it something where just because someone is tied up with a white nationalist or an anti-Semite, we shouldn't blame people for the company they keep?
Well, I don't know. Like, as everyone who has been talking about it has said, including one of the women who supposedly said that, or supposedly charged Mallory with anti Semitism, she herself said, look, that relationship is totally complicated. Right. And part of the relationship is that, her husband got murdered, and Farrakhan like came and took care of her and her family, and he basically acted as a mentor, right, and helped to make sure that she didn't break apart and her family didn't break apart, right? And so that's why I made that comparison last time when I was like, oh, so what are you going to do? Not invite Uncle Bob to Thanksgiving dinner, right? With the difference being that maybe Uncle Bob doesn't have a platform where he speaks to thousands and thousands of people, but he still holds like very nasty, very ugly beliefs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Should should I, if I were your friend, for example, and I knew that you still invited your Uncle Bob to Thanksgiving dinner, should I tell you, well, you either have to disassociate yourself from your Uncle Bob or we can't be friends anymore? Uh, I don't
What if
know.
I
Well, I
invited
think
David Duke to dinner?
well,
Are you, so is David Duke your uncle?
David Duke, well, no, David Duke and Farrakhan I see as analogs.
well,
Well, hold on,
Mm-hmm.
there's
wait,
a real
I don't
life
want.
there's a real life example, counterexample to this too, if you think about it. And I think having sort of having the public platform is sort of the key variable here too. Is when you think about Obama and was it Jeremiah Wright, his
Oh,
pastor?
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Reverend
So
Wright.
he
Yep.
denounced him. So there's a two cases, I guess, to juxtapose against each other here, right? I don't know where I have a
Mm-hmm.
particular opinion one way or another on this, but at least in terms of of two cases.
So
Well,
it's
so I am happy that you brought up that comparison, right? Because I actually, because I know that on the surface they seem the same, but I really don't think they are. Like, I think of the Reverend Wright as being all like he's squarely like in the tradition of Black liberation theology, and I actually think that a lot of the footage and the tapes that they have of him, like those were totally taken out of
I
context,
see.
right?
Yeah.
And right. And so those were taken out of context, but then Obama was like, which is going to be easier to like try and
Yeah.
explain to the American people
Yeah.
that these were taken out of context and this is actually what he means, or just
yeah.
throw him under the bus. I'm gonna throw him under the
Well,
bus, right?
lastly, though, I think that's the more fundamental point I was trying to get at is really sort of here of the context of it, and I guess this got back to our earlier discussion too, in talking about the events,
The MAGA.
the
Yeah.
mega thing. But in the sense here about it's perhaps it really is all about public interpretation of an issue just as much as sort of the substance behind the individual, right? In the case of Obama, there, right, as you said, just something here taken out of context, but yet the public conceptions have consequences. In essence, it's the same thing that occurred here in terms of being identified with Farrakhan.
Yeah, and also too, I mean, and then going back to Joe's point though, right? So again, like in thinking about leadership, like I mean, like people are a little screwy, right? I mean, like a person could think that what it is they're doing is for a bigger cause
Mm-hmm.
when they're really doing it for their own kind of personal like power or fame or whatever, right? Um, and and part of it, so I could see how Mallory it might be thinking to herself, like, I'm gonna sort of stick to my guns because I care about this cause
Mm-hmm.
and that's what's important. And I've been able to bring all of these different people to the table. I'm not going to get scared out of leadership, right? While at the same time, she could also, in saying to herself, this movement means more to me than anything else, also look at it and say, maybe by me being part of the leadership, I'm hurting the movement.
Mm.
So I don't know. Like I'm not her,
Yeah.
right? If I were her, I think I would have stepped down from leadership. But I can't. But I can't speak for her. I wasn't in that room when those alleged conversations took part. So
Howard, you want to touch this with the 20-foot pole, or?
Well, I mean, when I look at the Women's March and I look at the issue, I think of just contemporary mobilization more generally. So I kind of look at it, not only at the lens of the controversy, but just the difficulty it is today to create a movement. Unlike
yeah,
the age of Martin Luther King, where there were churches and clear kind of oriented goals, we now have a society that has so many micro subdivisions to it that it's really hard to get a broad march on something that should be widespread. That women of any faith, of any color, of any class, are facing a number of similar issues. I mean, certainly there are differences when you look at those intersections, but it's very hard to mobilize people in one continuous space. And I just think of what, as Leslie was saying, like, why do people show up to the march? And they show up not for necessarily the specifics. And you see this in hashtag movements as well, that they're responding to the broader issue, and everybody comes there with a different set of reasons. And so I find that, when I kind of look at the Women's March, and this year there were fewer people than the last few years, I just think of just the difficulty of trying to get people to share a space and share a common goal.
Hmm.
Can I ask a question to Leslie and Howard on this? Something that struck me too is what I was wondering is I've heard the criticisms of intersectionality as sort of in terms of a political rhetoric. Are we seeing that sort of here? The criticism being such that it can get away from fundamental issues and it's so focused on cleaving by different sorts of intersections that ultimately it pits groups against each other ultimately, because of these. I'm of this and this and this versus someone is of this and this and then in terms of identity or ideology or what have you. I mean, an empirical case to be thinking about how an intersectional sort of a political orientation ultimately in a way divides and conquers, or in terms of thinking about mobilization for a greater good, or
Well, certainly it creates complications. I think of the Toronto Pride March, where divisions ended up emerging between Black Lives Matters and the organizers of the march. And it led to a protest in the march that shut down the march. And, it was a matter of intersectionality. And I think it's important to kind of look at intersections and the differences that occur within causes and movements. But certainly, taken to its extreme, it becomes me first politics. And over the
hmm
last 5 or 10 years, this is kind of the politics that we've been promoting. not just
Yeah,
on the left and in terms of movements, but the mainstream politic as well.
yeah, and in me thinking specifically about the women's movement, right? I mean, and thinking about intersectionality. I mean, historically speaking, it like the movement was not a space where many women who weren't cisgender, who weren't heterosexual, right, who weren't white and who weren't at least middle class felt like they had a space. And even if they did have a space, they were there merely for the optics.
Mm.
Like that's what they were
Mm.
valued for.
Yeah.
See, we have diversity within our movement, but their voices were not valued. And part of me kind of feels like, maybe instead of thinking about this as like negative and being like, oh, it's so fractured, look at this, there is no one voice, is maybe what we should be thinking about this is like a movement or a newer movement in its infancy, which is allowing everyone to like sort of be seen and be like, oh, this is what it feels like to be seen. This is what it feels like to be heard, right?
Mhm.
And once we get it established that, like, okay, everyone, you see, you all got to have your say, you all got to be seen. Now that we've established like a certain baseline level of equality, maybe now we can get to the table and actually start like hammering out what this agenda really looks like.
That's
Well,
another,
certainly,
yeah.
I would agree with you, Leslie, that a successful movement is a movement that's able to have humility and that's able to kind of go through the stumbling blocks of figuring out what that common space is and being inclusive. Because certainly, this is a problem with a lot of movements that it excludes people at the cost of the goals that it says that it's trying to pursue.
Hmm. But ain't I a woman though, right? I mean, that's the question,
Uh,
right?
Exactly.
And now we turn to Richard Carpiano, a professor of public policy and sociology at the University of California, Riverside. Richard is a medical sociologist and public health policy scholar with a ton of work to his credit. He does work in a bunch of areas, including more recent work on under vaccination. He and Nicholas Fitz recently published Public Attitudes Towards Child Under Vaccination, a randomized experiment on evaluations, stigmatizing orientations, and support for support for policies in social science and medicine. It's a really good article. I enjoyed it. A great piece of medical sociology, and I look forward to talking about it. It's a pleasure to have you on the program. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, let's start. Maybe you could start us off by, giving us a sense of what the controversy is surrounding vaccination and anti-vaxxers. Who are they? What's going on?
Anti-vaxxers, we could is the common parlance that gets used in a lot of different ways, but empirically really represent a rather small population, a small but yet very vocal minority of the
Mhm.
larger population of concern of what we would call vaccine hesitant parents. In terms of so vaccine hesitancy can capture anything from somebody having some sorts of concerns, maybe about one or more vaccines for their child. They might delay having concerns of a child getting too many vaccines all at one time. Versus when we talk about, or even in general, could just be someone who goes through the motions, gets their child vaccinated, but is generally maybe not on board in terms of, or has some significant sorts of questions in regards to safety or other maybe sort of side effects that might emerge as a result of vaccinating their child. Versus the anti-vaxxer who is generally would be someone, a parent whose child has no vaccines, or at some point maybe started vaccinating their child and then stopped as a result of uh, well, not any number of different reasons, but we can attribute them to where this is really still a rather emerging literature. But we know that the influences of this get very heavily tied around networks, information that's found on the web, and then also more sort of broadly, science that's been debunked. That it was
Mhm.
a major study many years ago by now a discredited physician by the name of Andrew Wakefield, who published a piece in the Lancet, so a rather prominent, one of the most prominent international medical journals, postulating a link between the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that young children receive, and autism. That
Mhm.
ultimately, when investigated, was found to be fraudulent in terms, and unethical in terms of how the analysis was conducted, and based on a very small sample of children. And ultimately, his authors decided to not stand behind it, and the Lancet ultimately decided to retract the article. Yet, what's interesting is that myth or that finding caught fire and is still is persisted for a long time. Although it's now this has really kind of caught fire, and so we had historically, if we could track this sort of historically, we had certain sort of prominent celebrities who were getting behind this and concerned about it. Jenny McCarthy being probably
Right.
one of the most prominent about this. Um, so over time, the whole vaccine hesitancy or even an anti-vaxxer activism is not a new thing. That's always sort of existed. But to the extent to which we see it now, and the ways and media and even sort of just online, the internet enables sort of a more vocal, sort of active resurgence in a way is rather important. And it, while we might think of these as a very small group of the vaccine hesitancy population, the consequences of their actions really are rather significant in the
Well,
sense
yeah,
that.
there's been outbreaks, haven't there?
Yeah, so in terms of outbreaks, and so often we look at these. It starts to become a bit of a numbers game. If you look at sort of reports about states or the nation in terms of how many children are vaccinated, the numbers look really quite good to maintain herd immunity, which would be the idea that if you vaccinate enough people within a population, that they can provide a certain protection to those who can't be protected from it. Either they're too young or they're immunocompromised, or some people even have legitimate allergies to reactions to certain vaccines. Um, but but to the extent to which so while these numbers look big and everything looks protected, we know, well, really, these are infectious diseases. They're communicable, and so it's about who you see in your day to day. And fundamentally, this is a sociological problem in the sense that we have vaccine hesitancy clustering in particular communities within particular schools. And so as a result, this really sets the sort of groundwork or the potential for these types of outbreaks. Compounding that also are in many states we have vaccination is not mandatory. That there are options to exempt out of it as a result of some sort of philosophical or religious type of exemption in certain states. Um, Only 3 states actually make it a requirement for enrollment. A lot of talk about California initiating it, but actually it's West Virginia and Mississippi were the leaders in this, which is, I kind of laugh as a public health scholar, because generally when you think of those 2 states, you don't think of them as public health leaders on many things.
Right.
But in terms of taking action on that, that had been that is something that had been going on. But I digress. With the rise, we've also been seeing, so not only just this sort of rise in sentiment, rise in activism, but also sort of a rise in these opting out exemptions, which is also enables some or sets at least the potential for a lot of these vaccinations or a lot of these outbreaks to occur. But I guess for the average listener who's like, okay, public health wonk here, talking about something that's important to him and whatnot. I mean, this what I find really fascinating about this whole issue is more broadly as a sociologist, is really how the anti-vaccine movement and even vaccine hesitancy in general, and some of my work has been within the United States. I focus a significant amount of it in Canada too, and see some interesting similarities as well. Is really how this applies to sort of more broader sociological issues about information or misinformation, and and even
Right.
campaigns, the role of networks in circulating them, and even how some of these things get tied into broader political issues regarding populist politics and the role of a more sort of libertarian sort of streak that you might see. And so, really, this is. I mean, I could be talking with you about this, so you could make this about
Right.
an 8 podcast series. Um,
Mm.
so
Uh,
maybe I should stop there and let you
well, no,
guys jump in.
you know what? It's actually the perfect setup for my next question, which is so, like, tell us about your study because it was involving public perceptions and public reaction,
Absolutely.
which is very
Yeah.
important.
Well, we look at these. Well, there's so much attention that's paid to who's not vaccinating because
Mhm.
journalists cue in on that, and obviously to many people that might seem sort of unusual. It's counterintuitive.
Mhm.
Vaccinations are considered to be one of the greatest public health achievement. If you were to take Public Health 101, it would make a top
Mhm.
10 list of one of the greatest accomplishments of public health,
Yeah.
sanitation and other things.
Yeah.
So it does
Yeah.
seem rather counterintuitive, and so the stories will definitely focus in on that. What's not a news story is the fact that most parents go and get their child vaccinated, and maybe there's a little bit of crying, but otherwise it's not really much of an event. And so when
Mhm.
I was telling people that this is, I became fascinated, sort of just when the California outbreak had occurred, the Disneyland measles outbreak occurred,
Mhm.
and that's really how I started getting into this as an issue. And as I started getting into projects and I would talk with people about like, what it is that I study and the current things I'm looking at, I would notice, this, I would tell people before, and I study health disparities, and people will tell me more about what that's all about, sort of thing. But this was something that particularly I noticed really hit a nerve with people. Oh, those people are nuts. Those people are crazy. Oh, I can't believe that,
Mhm.
that people would do. They better stay away from my child. And
Mhm.
and so to me, it was just really fascinating to think about. So what is the regular what is the average public perception of this versus the studying always about what does an anti-vaxxer think and react and how we might sort of counter that. And there's so
So,
much sociological literature about sort of public perceptions about mental illness and about stigma, and really a lot of those ideas really do translate to this. But now looking in this case at an infectious disease.
so, Richard, can you give us an overview of your study? What were you looking for? What were the questions? How'd you do it?
Yeah, so my study, our study, and I have to give a lot of credit to my co-author Nick Fitz, who is just was a whiz with MTurk and these designs. He's now pursuing his doctorate in psychology at Duke. Um,
Hmm.
so having said that, this is really sort of out of a tradition of vignette studies that had been done in medical sociology and the sociology of mental health to try to measure sort of public attitudes regarding illness and sort of just the sort of public the social construction in essence of, of illness. And
Hmm.
what we tried to do here is we created a number of different vignettes that we randomized to present to people. In this case, this was a response on Amazon's MTurk throughout the United States. And they were presented with 4 different vignettes, one of 4 different vignettes. One of which
Hmm.
characterized described a mother who was very concerned about vaccinations and in terms of their safety, and was as a result has decided not that her child is not vaccinated at all. Second,
Hmm.
one situation where the mother has some concerns, and so as a result has decided to delay some vaccinations. A
Hmm.
third where the mother thinks that vaccinations are important, but life happens as a parent, and as a result, the child's not up to date as a result of just sort of competing demands. And in a fourth
Hmm.
condition where the mother thinks that vaccinations are really quite important, and as a result, ensures that her child is up to date whenever a vaccination is due. And so, after being exposed to one of those 4 vignettes, we gave the respondents a number of different measures that we adapted from a lot of the literature on stigma towards mental illness in terms of trying to get at people's attributions about the parent. So, to what degree they might blame the mother if the child
Hmm.
got sick or others sick. The degree to which they might be angry or have sympathy for the mother,
Right.
The degree to which they felt that there was sort of a need for separation, that there was sort of a characterization or boundary sort of being drawn of sort of an us versus them sort of
Mm.
about mothers like the one that got described, as well as sort of assessments about about the mother's sort of credibility in terms of thinking about information or advice that she might have to offer about parenting or about health issues of the child, and then also just the perceived sort of dangerousness that the parent might have. And then we
Mm-hmm.
also have some questions about the degree to which the respondent might want to be distance themselves or not, sort of live in either the same community or interact with either both the mother and as well as we had separate questions for the child as well as some questions around discrimination too, that they should be kept out of things or this mother should be hired. We even went to some sort of extreme sorts of examples about social exclusion. Um, what we found was very stark, which was actually sort of surprising to me, is the degree to which this really did fall in a gradient in the sense that respondents most strongly reacted to the kind of traditional anti-vaxxer sort of description of a parent with a child who was not up to date on any of them and intentionally. And then next to that, next strongest would be then the delayer to the, and then a little bit more nuanced, but still some negativity towards the mother who is just encountering just challenges in making the doctor's appointments and getting the child up to date. So in addition to that, but on top of that, what we found was equally or in some cases stronger reactions towards the mother's child, which was also interesting to thinking about sort of in this case, a stigma by association, perhaps, but also in the case of, it's the child's sort of, I guess, potential for carrying disease. We can think about this in just sort of almost like out of like classic literature or the Bible, the idea of like sort of avoiding the person who could be the carrier, sort of
Yeah.
in that regard. More broadly, though, in terms of in terms of thinking about policy and where to go with this in these findings, were that we found that these reactions were very strongly tied to the types of policies that these respondents would endorse or get behind. So we presented them with a range of options that span from rather benign things like that most people could probably get behind, such as more education or is needed, more public education is needed, to things that were very much very severe. Well, to things that were sort of on the books, so things like banning a child from school, like what would occur in California, or at that time period was on the books for being voted on. So that's the other thing to put this a little bit in context. We were catching a bit of a zeitgeist in terms of the news cycle, but then also some more extreme sorts of policies that were getting promoted or proposed or later implemented, even such as in relation to denying certain sorts of social benefits. If a child to a parent or if a child is not up to date. And ultimately what we're finding there is that the more sympathetic that somebody was, essentially the general pattern was the more sympathetic that someone was towards a parent, the more they were towards these kind of more lighter or softer sorts of policies. Public reporting of school coverage would be another example of that. And then the more strongly that they reacted to the parent and to the child, the more likely they were to be moving towards these much more sort of heavier-handed sorts of policies that would definitely, from an anti-vaxxer standpoint, be viewed as very, much more, very heavily intrusionist. Sort of, sometimes gets couched in rhetoric of anti-American or anti-freedom or unlibertarian, I guess you could say.
Yeah. So Richard, I really enjoyed the
Thank you very
article.
much.
And one of the things that got me thinking about was whether or not you think like stigma would have varied based on what vaccine or which vaccines you were talking about, right? So for example, like I think a lot about the HPV
Mm-hmm.
vaccine, right? And number one, I actually think that like all boys should have to take it, and I don't think girls should have to take it at all, because we then have to go on and take toxic oral contraceptives, right? And right, so we already have these things going on. So why not put the onus on boys, since boys are the ones who transmit
Hmm.
it,
Yeah.
right? Um, so, but we don't do that. So I was wondering whether or not you thought you would see different effects, right, in terms of like sort of like the sort of size, like the effect of like stigma actually being a thing. Number one, because we're talking about something that's associated with something that is very often stigmatized in our society, both sex and also sexually transmitted diseases, right? Although the way in which HPV is framed more as a sort of cancer preventative vaccine.
Right.
Right. So I was wondering whether or not you'd see like some similar effects there, and whether or not you think you might see gender effects there, right?
Yeah, no, that's such a great question. And the short answer to that is I would definitely think that we would see effects about that.
Will you do the studies?
Any funders listening? Um,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I mean, definitely for all the high uptake that we see for sort of the standard or the more established sort of child vaccinations, it's a definitely a different story for the HPV vaccine, and there is a lot tied into this idea that and I think a bit of a stigma around the idea that, well, you can get it through sexually transmitted through sexual transmission, and so therefore I'm giving this to my daughter. Well, now at least in some localities, boys as well, but giving it at a young age. And so this idea that, well, I mean, certainly among some families there was concern that, and this has now been uh, debunked quite nicely, I think, with studies. But this sort of concern that, well, if we give this to kids, kids are going to mistakenly think it's some license to go have sex. That they might think that they're sort of super protected and whatnot, and we know that that definitely hasn't occurred. So that's a misconception. But also, I think it hits on. I mean, ultimately, these are very heavily parental decisions, and parents, it's to think about their 12, 14-year old, thinking about, let's talk about sex, or even now the age has been moved down in certain jurisdictions of when kids have been.
To like 11.
Yeah. And so, this, my sweet little child, I have to think of them now as sort of this sexual being. It's certainly
Oh no.
discomforting for a parent. Um,
Mm.
and so, that's certainly going to undermine the uptake of it as well. So make a long story short, I would not be surprised if the findings were very different for that, for that particular vaccination.
So Richard, I was really fascinated with your study, and I like that you used vignettes and you're looking at social distance and you're looking at how people relate to one another. But I do a lot of work with policymakers, and what I was curious about is, there's a thing in policy where people say 1, 3, and 25, that the intern reads the 25 page report. They make a 3-pager that they send to their boss, who then makes a 1-pager that sends it to the decision maker. And so I was wondering, like, in terms of policy, how do you see that 1-pager, or what is the intervention that this is leading to that you think will make the most effective change here?
Well, this is where it gets complicated in terms of thinking about the whole about this particular issue about under vaccination and vaccine hesitancy in general. In that, well, it's good in general to be thinking about sort of what would be public support behind different policies if support moves one way or another. And we have extended this to looking at within British Columbia in terms of public attitudes towards different sorts of policies. Um, not in this sort of experimental situation, but just sort of looking just more broadly at sort of what people might be supporting and whatnot. But what I try to bring up in the discussion section of the paper, and this is where things get much more sort of challenging and more controversial, I guess you could say, to be thinking about, is as sociologists, we generally think of stigma as quite a bad thing, usually, terms of label
Mm.
being applied to a particular group and they're being outcast and whatnot. Within public health ethics, there's been a little bit more of a revision of this issue in the sense that one person particularly comes to mind would be the work of Ronald Baer, who is an HIV ethicist, who obviously in that case stigma would be terrible, and was a terrible approach in terms of thinking about different types of interventions for that particular disease. But at the same time, sort of brings up, which is widely recognized within public health, the stigmatization of cigarette smoking worked quite well.
Huh.
And so, does that mean, to what degree
Yeah.
is stigma as sort of an ethical? Is there an ethical basis of using stigma as a public policy lever, essentially? In this case, so we kind of try to weigh those issues and try to thinking about them. The potential to be pushing people sort of underground in this case and not getting. Uh, um, not converting. If the goal is to try to get as high as possible coverage, would that really be the would that be the most effective sort of solution to be bringing up, bring campaigns that really have sort of a bit more of a I vaccinated my child, why haven't you? And and really sort of putting the onus on and turning it around towards the anti-vaxxers and shining a lens on that, versus the other sorts of options that might be what gets discussed in this still emerging literature and debate and discussion around things such as, well, just focus on these more mild, less of sort of severe hesitant parents who are sometimes referred to as sort of the fence sitters. Convert those, and that should be enough to be able to maintain what we need. Um, and so there's not a straightforward with this paper policy prescription with it. Um, it's more, but what we were trying to do with it was really trying to capture this, try to bring sort of the other side to it of whereas so much is always focused on, again, the anti-vaxxer, the vaccine, or the vaccine hesitant population itself, is what exactly are the attitudes towards these people where it's sort of that might take it for granted that, I do this for my kid, or that parents do this for their children, and are generally, we know from public surveys that generally the vast majority of the public is on board with the utility of vaccination. And so kind of where does this attitudinal sort of fault line sort of stand was really sort of where we were going with this paper.
No, that was really the cool part of it. It made me think of all kinds of ideas. On the one hand, it made me think of the Chinese saying of "kill the chicken to scare the monkey," or
Mm.
in other words, there's evidence that you find that basically people are okay with stigmatizing the people who are refusing. Therefore, you might be able to have some impact on harsher policies or using stigmatization to scare away the people who are kind of thinking about it but aren't committed. But then on the other hand, I thought to myself of when I was a kid in the 80s and a teenager, and those commercials of with the eggs, and here's your brain, and then they crack it and fry it on the fry
Yeah.
pan, and here's your
Right.
eggs on drugs,
Yeah.
and we just legalized cannabis in Canada,
Yeah.
and so that didn't really work on the soft drugs. So so this is the kind of stuff I began thinking about, and where I was kind of pushing you to see where you might be thinking about in terms of how this would be used.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It really is really amazing how such a small group can be so vocal, and really what we are seeing on the policy side of it is how impactful they really can be in undermining efforts to maintain the public's health, in terms of even just some fairly basic sorts of measures, such as, say, public reporting, so that parents are aware of, within their school, how their school kind of fares, or different schools, how that gets challenged, or different, in Texas we know that there's certain candidates that they'll get behind and they'll support, and so this is it really. It's I think, and sadly, I mean, I really think we are sort of still only at the relative tip of the iceberg, and I hate to say it, but I think things are going to get worse going along. I'm not the only person saying that. Um, the support. I mean, you can see it from a social movements lens too. I mean, I always say that there's a great dissertation to be written here too in that regard. I mean, so much of these the public media stories are always about this mom here, and and these often are mothers who are making sort of appearances, and we know that mothers tend to make the majority of the health decisions for a child. Um, but in terms of the actual sort of organized, collective, grassroots sorts of efforts, it really is quite amazing. The pull that they can have, and even to the extent to which they get media coverage gives the public conception that they are much more numerous in size than what they are. So challenging, coming back and fighting that, particularly in the internet age where people have the PhD in Google, or they can access a scholar or a clinician online and Twitter and try to engage them, and or even sponsor panels. I fell into this when I was talking about this with a number of vaccination researchers and clinicians, getting invitations to panels that were essentially stacked with anti-vaxxers and serve as a tactic of sort of legitimating sort of their cause because they're on the same sort of panel as I always do myself a legit scientist. So all these sorts of different ways that they come about, and tactics that they employ, really present some different challenges, and ultimately have, in some countries, have resulted in, like Australia, taking some rather strong measures, such as their no jab, no pay policy, where denying different sorts of tax benefits to families if their child's not up to date, for instance. And seeing that, and now, or in the other case, retrenchment, I guess you could say, in terms of vaccination policy in Italy, and we're seeing, which is now, along with a lot of Europe, in a wave of a major measles epidemic.
You've been listening to the Annex Sociology Podcast. A special thank you to Richard Carpiano from UC Riverside. We discussed his article with Nicholas Fitz, Public Attitudes Towards Child Under Vaccination, a randomized experiment on evaluations, stigmatizing orientations, and support for policies, in the journal Social Science and Medicine. Also, a thank you to Howard Ramos of Dalhousie University for filling out on guest duty. It was wonderful to have you. We're on the web, sociocast.org/annex, on Twitter @sociannex, and on